You said something wrong about the church in the Middle Ages. Now the Inquisition is after you. They've used a leather strap to secure a device that looks like a two-way fork with two sharp points on your neck. One of its sides is pushing against your sternum, and the other against your chin. At first, you tried to keep your head up to lessen the pain, but you couldn't stay like this for long. The so-called heretic's fork wasn't deadly but made the victim suffer from the tiniest move. However, on the scale of pain, based on scientific research, this kind of suffering only gets 27 points out of 140. In this video, you'll find out about the worst kinds of torture in the history of humankind, so viewer discretion is advised. Tickle torture. You have, at least a few times in your life, been subjected to one of the less obvious kinds of torture. It's just that the executioner wasn't persistent enough when tickling you. In ancient China, this was the primary method of punishing delinquents from noble families since tickles didn't leave any traces of torture on the body, and the victim was able to recover quite fast, if the procedure didn't go too far, of course. In European countries, goats were employed as a torture device. The culprit was tied up, and salty water was poured on their feet to make the animal lick them. What's so bad about that, you might ask? It's just that there's an incredible number of nerve endings in the feet, and the goat's rough tongue would irritate them quite a lot. So, after a few hours, the tickling starts inducing not just laughter but also painful muscle contractions. You lose virtually all control over your body, which causes extreme stress, anxiety, and exhaustion. Moreover, the nerve endings responsible for reacting to tickles also signal pain. It's just that if we're being tickled for fun and for a short time, our reaction to stress doesn't go beyond laughter and light sensations in the body. However, if done for hours, this causes the nervous system such an overload that the lightest touch causes unbearable physical pain. Now, imagine that it's not your feet being tickled, it's your private parts. In India, the interrogation of criminals was accompanied by placing a small bug on the culprit's genitals and covering the insect with a walnut shell so that it couldn't escape. The constant irritation of supersensitive areas caused by the bug's movements made the torture unbearable very quickly, and the executioners got any confession they wanted. Eventually, tickle torture could result in death by asphyxiation if the victim developed a throat spasm caused by uncontrollable laughter. Other possible outcomes were cardiac arrest or a brain aneurysm provoked by severe stress. Yet, on the pain scale, tickle torture only got 32 points, since the suffering it brought was mostly psychological. This is very similar to the next kind of torture. Chinese water torture. The Chinese water torture was terrifying in its simplicity. At first, the person was immobilized, and then cold water would slowly drip onto their face or head. Gradually, the constant skin irritation caused by the drops and splashes would make the nervous system hypersensitive. The inability to move and the waiting for the next drop would literally start driving the person insane. Maybe you've even seen this torture in movies. Here's the paradox, though, there's no proof that it was ever used in China. This kind of torture was first described by an Italian lawyer on the cusp of the 16th century. In the mid-18th century, German and French doctors attempted to use this method to cure mental disorders. Moreover, the very term Chinese water torture came into active use owing to a trick by the legendary Harry Houdini. So, does water drop torture actually work? Since it can look harmless at first glance, a few bloggers have dared to try it out themselves. The water drop torture was also tested by the Mythbusters. All participants knew they were actually perfectly safe and could be freed at any moment. Yet, everyone went through a hellish experience. At first, the experimenters suffered from cold, thirst, psychological tension, and physical discomfort. Then, their entire body started aching, and breathing problems arose. It all ended in panic and desperate pleas to be released. That is the worst part. In addition, after this episode, the Mythbusters received an anonymous letter whose authors reportedly found out that Chinese water torture may cause mental issues that persist for 20 hours. So, on the pain scale, water drop torture received 40 points, and a huge question as to whether it was actually used in practice. At least because it was replaced by much crueler kinds of water torture. One of them was the Swedish drink. Swedish drink. Its name was invented by the Germans during the 30 Years' War when they became victims of the Swedish army servicemen, mercenaries, or marauders. This method of torture went as follows. Through a funnel, the perpetrators would pour buckets of the most disgusting liquids imaginable into the victim's throat. They used everything from urine and filth to manure and feces. This was the Swedes' way of torturing civilians to force them to give up their money or food. Not only did the victims feel disgust and humiliation from being subjected to the Swedish drink, but they also contracted deadly diseases. Furthermore, their stomachs stretched, causing horrific pain. The perpetrators would often use wooden planks to put pressure on the victim's bloated belly or hit it with sticks to deepen the suffering. So, on the pain scale, the Swedish drink got 46 points out of the possible 140. Very often, one kind of torture ranged from public humiliation accompanied by intense discomfort to a death punishment with unbearable suffering. One such hellish invention was the king. The king. It was a large board consisting of two halves with a hole between them, used to keep the device on a person's neck. The king wasn't secured in any way, so the culprit had to support the board with their hands and balance it while walking. To intensify the punishment, the person in a king could also be chained, stopping them from ever sitting down. Moreover, the king's parameters would change according to the severity of the punishment. It could weigh anywhere from 9 to 15 kilograms and have a square, rectangular, or disproportionate irregular shape. Sometimes, they were even double or triple. Often, a king would be so large that the victim would be unable to touch their face to eat or drink. If they weren't helped by those who cared, the victim would die a slow death of hunger and thirst. Yet, the king was also used as an execution device. The convict was placed inside a tall cage made specifically for this purpose. A king would be secured above, then a prop would be taken from under the victim's feet, and they would slowly be strangled with the board on their neck. That's how people were executed in China as recently as 1900, suffering excruciating pain. On the pain scale, king torture sits at 62 points. However, even this horror is far from being the worst thing people ever came up with. Europeans during the Middle Ages were especially creative in their acts of cruelty. It was then that they invented and actively used a contraption called the Judas cradle. The Judas cradle. It was a spiky wooden or metal pyramid secured on a support with a special clamp over it. First, the victim's arms and legs were tied, and then their trunk was secured with a metal ring attached to the ceiling or the wall with ropes. After this, the person was slowly seated on the pyramid's sharp point. I won't go into the horrific anatomical details since it's clear anyway that the process caused unbearable pain. Moreover, such torture could go on for days. If the executioners wanted to receive a confession or other information but the victim remained silent, they tied weights to their arms and legs, causing the pyramid edges to gnaw at the poor person's body even more. As if that wasn't enough, the Judas cradle was never cleaned, so it became the breeding ground for deadly bacteria. Even if the victims managed to survive, they often died of infections. At any rate, they remained scarred physically and psychologically for the rest of their lives. That's why the Judas cradle received 79 points on the pain scale, crossing the midpoint. However, the first device to go beyond 100 in our list is the oubliette. The oubliette. The oubliette was a horizontal tunnel with the only way out in the form of a grated opening above, used as a dungeon. Often, it was so narrow that the prisoners couldn't even sit down. Moreover, oubliettes were built right there in the castle so that the victims could hear human voices and smell the food, causing them even more psychological suffering. Yet, the real torture was the fact that the prisoners were literally forgotten about in these holes, and they slowly died of thirst, hunger, exhaustion, and infections. Compared to this, a Judas cradle execution was a swift way to relieve one's suffering. The oubliette is a kind of entombment which has been practiced since ancient times on all continents. In the Roman Empire, the most influential Vestals who had broken their virginity pledge were sentenced to death. It was against the law to shed their blood, though, so they were buried alive, fated for a slow, desperate death. If you think this insane practice remained in days past, you're wrong. In Mongolia, this barbaric execution method was still in use until at least 1933. So, entombment in its different variations receives 108 points on the pain scale. But what if you're not alone in this closed space? Then, it's an entirely different kind of punishment. Rat torture. As far back as the 1st century AD, the cruelest methods of torture were devised. They say that one such method involved putting a victim into a barrel with hungry rats, which quickly ate the person alive. In India, criminals were made to wear wide pants that were first tied around the ankles and then filled with rodents. Any ideas as to which body part suffered the most and how painful it was? However, medieval torturers took it even further. They tied the victims down to immobilize them, then placed a bottomless cage on their abdomen and filled it with rats. To make it even worse, they put hot wood coal on the grates. As the rats became unbearably hot, they first tried gnawing at the cage in desperate attempts to escape. Later, though, the rats realized they were standing on a soft human body and started eating their way out through it. Sometimes, the cage was put on the victim's head, near the mouth, or other body parts. I'll let your imagination fill in the details. The most horrible thing is probably the fact that in South American countries, rat torture was in use until the 1980s. It received 112 points on the pain scale. It would seem that there's nothing worse than this, but before we get to the most horrifying tortures that scored the maximum of 140 points, there are still two more devices, the first of which is the rack. This is another deadly invention of the Middle Ages. It looked like a wooden frame with rollers on both ends. The person's limbs were tied to them, and when the torturers started turning the rollers, the victim's arms and legs would stretch in different directions. This caused unbearable pain due to joint displacement, muscle and ligament ruptures, and, in the most horrific cases, even bone fractures. The executioners could torture the victim like this for hours or even days to beat a confession or the necessary information out of them. Sometimes, a specifically trained person would supervise the victim's condition to keep them conscious and alive until a specific time. So, it's unsurprising that just threatening someone with the rack would often be enough to obtain the necessary information. This horrible type of torture received 116 points on the pain scale. However, citizens of ancient Greece managed to outperform even the cruelty of medieval European torturers by creating one of history's most terrifying torture devices: the brazen bull. According to stories, it was built by an Athenian named Perillos as a commission for a Sicilian tyrant, Phalaris, in the 6th century BC. It was a hollow copper statue of a bull with a hatch on its side. A person would be pushed inside, the hatch would be shut, and then the torturers would start a fire under the bull's belly. Furthermore, the statue's nostril structure made the victim's screams sound like the bull's bellow. Yet this barbarism was apparently not enough. After the execution, the victim's bones were used to make jewelry, which was then sold in markets. The inventor of this hellish machine quickly realized that doing business with tyrants was a bad idea, as the first person Phalaris tested the brazen bull on was Perillos himself. First, the man's skin started burning where it touched the metal. Then, the hot air gradually burned his airways and lungs. He slowly cooked alive before choking to death or going unconscious. However, before this, Perillos suffered agony that reached 130 points on the pain scale. Even this horror, though, does not compare to the fate of those sentenced to lynching. This is definitely one of the most barbaric punishments in humanity's history, and it hails from Asia. It was used in China, Vietnam, and Korea right until the early 20th century to punish perpetrators of the most heinous crimes, such as mass murder and high treason, as well as to eliminate the emperor's personal enemies. This comes as no surprise, since the victim would be tied to a pole in a crowded space to turn the execution into public humiliation. Then, a few torturers would slowly cut pieces of flesh out of the convict's arms, legs, and chest. Historical records indicate that during lynching, the victim would suffer between 100 and 3,000 wounds. That's why this torture is also dubbed death by 1,000 cuts. Although experts state that with such wounds, a person would most likely die within 20 minutes, sometimes the victim's family would bribe the executioners to inflict a fatal wound right away. This wouldn't remove the physical pain, but it's important to remember that for the Chinese, lynching was also a spiritual punishment. According to their beliefs, this disfigurement of the body would prevent the victim from being whole and healthy in the afterlife. This horrific execution method officially remained in use in China until 1905. It received the maximum 140 points on the pain scale. I have told you all this exclusively for educational purposes and to tickle your nerves. But I hope it didn't reach torture level. If you enjoy experiencing extreme sensations without putting yourself in danger, you'll find many exciting videos on my channel.